headquarters in Washington, D.C., and good afternoon, good evening to those joining in the Caucasus and Central Asia. My name is Mark Horton. I'm an assistant director in the IMF's Middle East and Central Asia Department, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the very first ever online presentation of the IMF's Regional Economic Outlook for the Caucasus and Central Asia, or the CCA. We are reaching you by streaming from imf.org and by rebroadcast from partners in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Russia, and Uzbekistan. This includes central banks, ministries, universities, research institutes, and business associations. This is very exciting for us, and many thanks for joining. Our presentation comes at a difficult time for the CCA region and a time of dramatically different country, regional, and global outlooks. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a substantial effect on the region. 10,000 cases have been identified to date in the CCA, with 100 deaths. Our heartfelt sympathies go out to those in the region dealing with the virus, families, friends, medical workers, and those affected by social distancing and restrictions on travel, companies, meetings, and other events. The sharp decline of oil prices is another major challenge for the economies in the region right now. This is an unprecedented and difficult set of shocks. We will hear this morning during the event from Mr. Jihad Azur, the director of the IMF's Middle East and Central Asia Department. Jihad will provide an overview of developments, policy advice and responses, our revised forecasts, and the outlook and risks, and how the IMF and others are helping. We will then hear from two distinguished panelists, Mr. Koba Gvenetadze, who is chairman of the National Bank of Georgia, Georgia's central bank. Koba has served as chairman of the National Bank since 2016, and before that he worked for the IMF here in Washington, in Bishkek, and in Baku. He was also Deputy Minister of Finance and Deputy State Minister. We'll also hear from Mr. Kairat Kelembetov, who is governor of the Astana International Financial Center in Nur-Sultan. Mr. Kelembetov has served in this position since 2015. Previously, he was the governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan, and before that, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Trade and Economic Development, and head of the Samruk Casino holding company. AIFC is a financial hub that aims to bring together for the CCA region the best practices and opportunities offered by similar financial centers around the world. The presentations will be followed by a short question and answer session. So with that, Jihad, I'll turn things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. It's indeed an exceptional moment, not only because we are presenting our outlook remotely, and for the first time not within the region, but also because of what the global economy is enduring. It's indeed a crisis like no other. And this crisis is hitting everywhere in the world, including in our region in Central Asia and Caucasus countries. And for the region, the shock is even bigger because it's a dual shock coming from the impact of the COVID-19 and also coming from the fact that this came at a time where oil price inflicted on the region a second shock. In the last 30 years, the region did not go through this level of economic challenges. And for us to understand the impact of the shock, I think it's very important to look at the waves that the shocks came into the region. One is the epicenter of the crisis was nearby in China and some other countries with whom Caucasus and Central Asian countries have a strong economic relationship. And this is where we see that the impact on these trading partners had a disruptive effect on the trade and the economies of the region. In addition to that, the only way to combat the coronavirus was to gradually shut down the economy, which through these containment measures have had also an additional impact on trade, on services, as well as also on other economic activities. But it was not the only shock that the region has to face. The second shock is the shock of drop in oil. Very quickly, we saw the demand for oil dropping because global activities have declined. And then at the non-extension of the OPEC Plus agreement, the oil price plunged. We went to a situation where we had an excess supply by more than 12 million barrels a day, which in fact also fueled additional pressure on the oil market. We are currently in a situation where oil prices are historically low, the lowest in the last 2 decades. In real terms, we are at rates that we didn't see since 1973, which for the oil exporting countries in the region is a big shock. In addition to that, there is a great deal of uncertainty because when you see the when you see the level of volatility in the oil market, it adds on the complexity for decision makers to manage their economies. However, the region reacted and reacted fast. And in fact, the two main objectives of what the government put in place were how to protect lives and how to protect livelihoods. And for that, CCA countries deployed certain number of measures on the healthcare side, containment measures through what others did in terms of travel, border closure, social distancing, closing certain number of activities, and also the support of the healthcare system by scaling up and improving the quality of public health services provided. This, in fact, was to protect lives. On the other hand, in order to protect economies, government immediately initiated certain number of fiscal as well as also monetary measures. They have introduced fiscal packages on an average of 4% of GDP, which is relatively high, equivalent to what, for example, advanced economies did, slightly higher to what EMs did, where on average the fiscal package was between 2.5% to 2.7%. In addition to that, some countries resorted to monetary measures in order to stabilize the economy, reduce the impact of capital outflow, and also provide additional support in terms of access to finance to the private sector by trying to keep liquidity and the infrastructure of the market functioning, and also by providing support to SMEs. And this is still ongoing, and we will see later on during the year how this is going to affect the outlook of the economy. Turning now to the outlook, the challenge in the outlook this year is the level of uncertainty is still very high. Uncertainty on how effective the measures that were introduced will be, how fast the recovery globally is going to be, and what shape this recovery will take. We don't know if it is going to be a V-shaped recovery, the way we have already projected it. We don't know yet how long it would take the advanced economy to recover. And therefore, it's very important to keep an eye on the situation and update our outlook. And for the background here, we had to revise our numbers on a country-by-country basis more than 4 to 5 times before getting to our regional economic outlook. When we look at the outlook for this year, we see a big drop in terms of growth, a drop that exceeded 5 to 5.4% expected in 2020. I think it's important to mention that prior to the crisis, CCA economies were performing well. We're performing at a growth rate that was exceeding the level that we had in the EMs. This drop of 5% is substantial, and it's different between countries. But this drop is also coming with another 2 deterioration on the macroeconomic side. One is the deterioration in the current account, and this is especially for the CCA oil exporting countries that we see here in yellow, where we see a big drop in their current account, and also we see also a big drop in their fiscal balance. We expect the level of current account deficit to be around 8% this year, and for the fiscal balance to be around minus 6%. Last year, we had a positive fiscal balance for the CCA countries. Therefore, it's a double whammy shock that affected both revenues as well as also affected the fiscal situation of the CCA countries. In addition to that, uncertainties are still high. The first uncertainty is on the medical side. When we look at the public health indicators, we see that there are A, disparities in countries in CCA, and B, the level of public health indicators is relatively low, especially when it comes to the government expenditures. Therefore, here is the first challenge that those countries are facing. The additional challenge is the cash flow. Many countries rely on remittances or rely on input of foreign currencies coming with the level of tourism that those countries receiving. Kyrgyz, Tajik, Uzbekistan, they have high level of remittances. Georgia, or for example, Azerbaijan and Armenia, they count on high level of tourism. Therefore, uncertainties are high, but also uncertainties are made even more challenging because of two important factors. One is countries are witnessing increase in their public debt, and the level of amortization is large, is nearing $30 billion at a time when we see emerging markets being faced with the challenge of accessing finance. In the peak of the shock, we saw more than $100 billion leaving EMs. And currently, we see a revival of the issuance market, yet we see a kind of two tracks. Countries who have high level of rating are able to come back to the markets. Those who don't are still faced with the challenge of accessing the market. Therefore, policies are very important now. And the policy priorities, the way we see them, should be based on three pillars. Pillar number one, still protect lives and protect livelihoods. Protect people's life is by making sure that on the medical, on the healthcare, on the containment measures side, public expenditures are up to the right level. And even if the fiscal space is limited or non-existent, those are priorities countries need to reprioritize in order to make sure that they have enough resources for that, because this is important for the livelihood of people, for their life, but also for the economic stability. The second pillar is to protect the engines of the economy. We don't want this shock to get protracted and infiltrate into the various parts of the economy, and therefore fiscal and monetary instruments need to be used. Fiscal, one is to increase the coverage of the social safety net. And this is an issue that now is becoming more and more important, and it has to be complemented by supporting the small and medium-sized companies through a certain number of targeted and timely measures on the tax and revenue side, but also on the expenditure side. But those measures need to be activated quickly and need to be time-bound. This is of great importance because we don't know how long this crisis will last. Other measures are in terms of monetary measures, improving access to finance, providing liquidity to the banks, making sure that the financial infrastructure is still working and working well, and use digital and new technology in order to increase the level of financial inclusion and address some of the challenges that came with this crisis. Last but not the least, I think it's very important to start thinking about the recovery. We don't know how the recovery will come or when it comes, but it's very important to take lessons from the past in order to accelerate the reforms. CCA countries were good in 2015 and 2016 in introducing certain number of key reforms that allowed them to address the shock of 2015, but also to recover and recover fast. I think this is something that needs to be contemplated, and certain number of additional measures need to be taken into consideration, especially that neighboring countries and economies that are important for them are also affected, like, for example, Russia. In addition to policy measures, there are policy mistakes to avoid, and there are certain number of challenges to address. The first one is make sure that health spending is up to the level, both in terms of infrastructure as well as also in terms of coverage. The second priority is make sure that government are reaching out to the vulnerables. The high level of informality and the weak financial capacity for small companies is an additional pressure on the social fabric, and therefore it's very important to help through social programs address this issue. Debt sustainability, we saw earlier that debt overhang is an important challenge for countries in the region, yet in different pressures, but this is an important issue. Monetary and financial sector policies are important, especially to make sure that we manage properly the risk of capital outflow, and this needs to be backed by advancing the reform agenda. A certain number of reforms were initiated. They need to be accelerated. Some of the reforms that were dragging need now to be put forward. And this is a way for those economies to increase the level of productivity and address their weaknesses. There is an important element that became now more and more valid for the region is strengthening the regional cooperation. This is important in order to avoid that trade restrictions are introduced, especially on food and medicine. And this is something that is important for the region, especially for landlocked countries. And also provide access to to health services, especially when you have migrant workers, and which is the case in several countries. Support fragile countries who have both in terms of income or infrastructure a certain number of challenges, and sustain regional cooperation. And I think this is a moment where the region can come together as a market and also as a partnership. Last slide and last point is how we at the fund we're trying to help. And we have divided our work into 4 pillars, 2 financial pillars and 2 policy pillars. The financial pillar, we have initiated the RAPID facility that the first country in the world who has benefited from it was from the region, Kyrgyz Republic, who got the first one. It's a $100 billion facility, and now we have more than 100 countries who have applied for that. Purpose of it is to help countries address the immediate impact of the shock that is inflicted on their economy, especially those who are facing balance of payment challenge. But also we have activated other instruments, the use of grants, especially for countries who have very low income, and also the use of other instruments in order to allow EMs to have access to liquidity, as well as also to address a certain number of other challenges. We are pressing on the international community, both on the bilateral and some other institutions, to also swiftly come in order to help countries deal with their debt overhang. On the other side, on the policy side, and this is based on the huge demand we got, we are scaling up our engagement with countries to have tailor-made solutions for their issues, benefiting from what other countries have done, and also benefiting from the fact that our technical departments on the fiscal, on the monetary, or on the legal are putting forward. Last but not the least, we are strengthening the level of coordination with our traditional partners, the World Bank, ADB, AIIB, EBRD, but also the Eurasian Fund, trying to mobilize all the resources, both international and regional. We have had a very successful IFI coordination meeting for the CCA that helped converge on the priorities and also exchange what each institution and country is doing. And also we're trying to mobilize resources for debt relief, especially for the low-income countries. This is, of course, work in progress. Now we are thinking the next step, how we can help countries in the recovery, and how we can help countries if this recovery will not come soon. With that, I would like to, again, welcome you all and thank you for participating at this unusual way of launching our regional economic outlook. And now back to Mark, who is going to moderate the discussion with our 2 distinguished panelists that I would like to thank them for participating with us today. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Jihad. Well, as I said at the outset, we have 2 distinguished panelists from the Caucasus and Central Asia. First, we'll hear from Mr. Koba Gvenetadze, the governor of the Central Bank of Georgia, and second from Kairat Kelembetov, the governor of the Astana International Financial Center. We'd like to hear from them as policymakers and as participants in the financial sector and hear their take first on Jihad's presentation of the outlook and how they see developments and prospects from their positions. So first we'll go to Koba in Tbilisi.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, Washington. Good afternoon, Nur Sultan. Warm greetings from Tbilisi. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And Jihan, I also would like to thank you personally and the staff of MCD department for putting together new regional economic outlook in these difficult circumstances. And for its important focus on the nature of the shock, on policy actions, on vulnerabilities and risks, and the way forward recognizing the huge uncertainties we are facing. To pick up on what Jihad was discussing about the regional dimension, I want to highlight the importance of the regional integration and trade channels in circumstances like this. Today, we see that supply disruptions make it costly to transport food and products across the border. Some countries are also restricting export of goods and products. This means that trade may fall even far than it is projected at this point. That is why it is really important that as a region we integrate when we cooperate well. Otherwise, this could disrupt domestic production and it will have adverse impact on most vulnerable in our countries. So I think that this coordination implies simplifying the rules of transport for transport companies, of course, without hurting healthcare side and response. I think that this would definitely help in this situation. On top of that, we should recognize with some irony, though, that the current locked down situation shows how inefficient and damaging living in a closed economy is. I think this is clear evidence for the region, for CCA, and for the whole world that first we have to do our best to recover from this situation as quickly as possible. And the second of all, we have to strengthen the economies and financial integration in the future. As you, of course, know, Georgia has a very strong inspiration and commitment to economic integration with the EU, and this is what we will continue to do with the region as well. Next, I would like to note that importance of gradually building resilience has once again proved to be the best tool to deal in situations like this. And of course, a crisis is never welcome, but in Georgia, we have been taking steps to be prepared for challenging like this. And let me explain how. First of all, for the last several years, we have been building up foreign exchange reserves of the National Bank of Georgia to use them in situations like this. Sometimes it also led to some criticism towards the National Bank of Georgia, but we were sure that that's really necessary to do. And also picking up from what Jihad mentioned, CCA countries, in line with other emerging markets, have experienced substantial outflow of capital. And this outflow actually is much larger than we have experienced during 2008 financial crisis. But now accumulated reserves are enabling us to intervene in the foreign exchange market, to dampen disruptive conditions and the significant undervaluation of the national currency, and to reduce price and financial stability risks. Together with the government, with the parliament, we have been also very actively working to reduce the risks and related to high dollarization in the economy, and all this is helping now. In addition, we have been very actively implementing financial stability measures. Specifically, we have introduced so-called responsible lending framework, which allows financial institutions to lend to the borrowers only once the creditworthiness of the borrowers is checked. And right now, this is helping a lot with most vulnerable for those people who, for some reason or for even a short period of time, are not able to repay their loans. And with this approach, and together with implementation of supervisory measures, now we are meeting this challenge with a well-capitalized banking system, ample liquidity, sustainable level of leverage, and sound asset quality. I think this is a very good starting point to deal with crises like this. Ministry of Finance also has built quite sizable buffers to take care of urgent and emergency-related, health-related expenditures. And this is helping also to deal with this difficult situation. As a separate point, I want to emphasize the role of having an active IMF program, which gives opportunities to countries to receive advice on a permanent basis. But what became even more important for the case of Georgia, having active program is enabling us to mobilize resources quickly and mobilize these resources in a greater amount than other countries. We have reached a staff-level agreement with the IMF mission, and now we are expecting a board discussion of our extended fund facility program. And what is also important, it enabled us to mobilize resources very quickly, and it also gives positive signals about the right macro policies which Georgian authorities have been implementing. Lastly, there is no doubt that financial crisis like this entails borrowing from donors, from bilateral donors, from international donors. Of course, there will be some grant element of this assistance, but most of it will be in loans from international organizations, from bilateral donors. But let's not forget that this borrowing will be in the form of United States dollars in most cases. This means that after the crisis, developing countries, emerging countries will enter the new phase with higher debt and higher dollarization. So it means that, and we have to continue conducting right macro policies, but reducing dollarization, reducing these vulnerabilities is going to take time. Because of this, I think that it's very important that international financial institutions, while considering provision of assistance, think very seriously to provide assistance in local currency denominated tools. This will enable us, developing countries, emerging countries, to go through this period much better and be prepared after recovery time. To summarize, on a regional level, our countries need to make sure that we cooperate even more than before. And we have to believe that globalization will continue bringing its benefits. On a country level, we have to conduct prudent macro policies and counter-cyclical macro policies. Coordination at the authorities level is very important. This is what we are doing in Georgia, and this is what other countries have to do. And finally, our cooperation with international organizations, with IFIs, is as important as never before, because it gives us opportunity to use professionalism of the staff of these organizations, global experience which these organizations have. And last but not least, we can use financial resources of these institutions. With this, I want to wish all of you and your loved ones healthy health recovery in these unusual and unprecedented circumstances. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Koba. We heard some very important messages about regional integration, about continued cooperation, about resilience and buffers, about a strong starting point, well-designed policies, international partnerships, including on local currency lending. Thank you very much. So let's turn now to Kairat Kelembetov, who is joining us from the Astana International Financial Center in Nur-Sultan. Kairat?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for IMF for this good opportunities, timely discussion. So, and I think that the presentation of Jihad was very much relevant. And I also would like to support this like a three pillars approach, which has been done in the presentation. But as I put it, the different names, BCG style, like flatten, fight, and future. So I think that starting from the response to the epidemiological crisis, Kazakhstan did very quick, strong, and very relevant response. So you know that it was a special statement of President of Kazakhstan about the state of emergency regime, being involved, quarantine regime in the big cities. So still the lockdown being extended till May 11th, which to my mind saved many lives and really was a very professional response. At the same time was a huge support to the economy. It was a huge anti-crisis package, which includes also support of the medical area, which is size of $10 billion. Again, this is because of the country has a fiscal space due to the huge resource of central bank and national fund, which is altogether was around $90 billion. I think that the first, let's say, when we're talking about the flatten, and let's say it was like the best practice globally, at the same time, we start to realize it's not just like a first stage, because everybody agreed now that we don't know what will be the second wave of the virus or not. So it means that it's a real uncertainty, and means that we should focus in a midterm period to strengthening the healthcare system's capacity, also to build the intensive care units or in each city. So we have to be really be prepared, because nobody knows what happened in November, March. So this is the first. The second was also because the economy being shut down, like Jihad mentioned, in all countries. So we've got also his significant support of the government to the people who lost their jobs. And I think that in Kazakhstan it was a special benefit, so around $90 per capita, and 4 million people been covered by this measure. And it also was a significant measure in the fiscal area. It was a tax holidays. It was a special also funding for lending program for SMEs, supporting of infrastructure project and a project in agriculture area. So that's, I think, that was also relevant short-term response. And again, it's a two measures. From one side, like I mentioned, significant reserves of Kazakhstan, and from the other side, due to reforms which was done previously. Already been mentioned that it was a response in 2015 and 16 to the oil collapse, oil prices collapse in end of 2014. And if you remember, the Kazakhstan moved to the inflation targeting regime, which is again, which means an exchange rate policy free float, which is really create a system which can absorb any shocks. So means that we already been ready to absorb the shocks of the volatility of the oil prices. And from the other side was the structural reforms, which we call 5 institutional reform and 100 concrete steps, where the Astana International Financial Center also been created, and it was like a measure how to strengthening the institutional capacity of the quasi-government and government sector in Kazakhstan. And these measures still, the government now thinking about the additional package, how to help to the companies which are priority subsectors of the economy in Kazakhstan. And here we now have to talk about what is the kind of scenarios we are meaning for the next couple of years. So the experts in scenario planning told us that you cannot plan more than 3 months even now, and all of these kind of particularly scenarios like V, double OMI, L, or U-shaped scenarios are really all very difficult for countries in the region. And I think the relevant approach would be really to move to full capacity to the structural reforms in the economy, in fiscal area, in monetary policy, in other areas, which I mean, in concrete terms, that definitely should be strengthening capacity of the in social area, in areas like education, like distance online learning, and healthcare. Also, digitalization is becoming a serious measures which the countries should be done as fast as possible. Number two is in case of the commodities-rich countries is also the diversification towards the new winners and the new sectors which I think would be the beneficiaries of the new business model globally, like agriculture, for example. And I think the Kazakhstan has a great, and the region of Central Asia has a great opportunities for this. So here I think that I also would like to join to Chairman Koba, who mentioned that it's very much important, the regional cooperation. So it seems like it will be not the very, let's say, not peak of or growth of the globalization. It will be some slowdown of globalization, but it means that it's very much important. So between macro regions, it should be good linkages, and within the macro regions, it should be good cooperations. And I think we are in a Eurasian Economic Union, or let's say in a post-Soviet Union space. We have to really also to increase our trade and to increase our cooperation in many dimensions, and first of all, trade and supporting each other in the epidemiological crisis. So here I would like to conclude that very much important is be very much committed to the reform in structural reforms, which is always the agenda of the of the IMF and World Bank and many other institutions. So for Kazakhstan is the diversification of the economy, reorientation of privatization. I agree with my Georgian colleagues in terms of we should think about midterm borrowing programs for the Treasury and Ministry of Finance. Previously worked on the programs of issuing bonds denominated in local currency. It can be like Euro clearable or with a clear stream partners. So, but this program is also very much important. So it means that fiscal space is good for short-term response, but in a mid and long term, we should think about how to relaunch capital markets, how to relaunch the economy, how to really build the not just stabilization program, but economic recovery program. And these are also very much important and for monetary authorities, because been mentioned that from the previous global financial crisis 2008, still the problem on non-performing loans is significant. So recent asset quality review in February shows a little less than 20% of the portfolio of the bad loans. I think here we should really bring the scheme of the asset recovery scheme for Kazakhstan, and which is, to my mind, would be very relevant to be prepared to the new wave of crisis. So from liquidity crisis to financial crisis, we should really prevent it, and we have a lot of opportunities. I see the role of the IMF for in two main tiers. One is in regional integration, and the second is strengthening the institutional capacity of the fiscal and monetary authorities in our countries. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Kairat. That was a second important commentary. We heard about the importance of having strong institutions when a crisis hits. You mentioned in particular the floating exchange rate as being useful. We also heard about the large and multidimensional nature of the response of the Kazakh authorities, and also very quick. But it was particularly useful to hear your thinking about what comes after the crisis in terms of structural reforms in education, distance learning, digitalization, keeping the focus on diversification, and also, again, an emphasis on regional cooperation and integration. So thank you to both of you for your comments. We're going to move to some questions, and I have to say, I have to thank you that we have received an enormous number of questions, so we've tried to group them into 4 different categories. So we'll start with those and see how far we get. Our first question comes from a number of agencies, from Lulia Salter of the French Embassy in Tbilisi, and similar questions from the Tazabek news agency in the Kyrgyz Republic, and from Sputnik News in Armenia. And the question is, and I'll pose it to Jihad, do you see significant differences across the region in terms of the impacts of the shocks, including between the oil exporting countries and the oil importing countries, perhaps between the Caucasus and Central Asia?
Well, of course, the shock is the same or coming from the same sources, but it has different impact on countries. And maybe I will try to group them. Countries who have a strong oil and gas sector will be definitely more affected in terms of their current account, in terms of their fiscal balance. But usually those countries have high level of buffers, and therefore they can utilize this as a way to cover for the lack of access to the financial market, especially for the EM category. Therefore, for those, the impact is bigger, uncertainties are higher, but in the short term, they have the capacity to respond. And yet, I think, as Khairat mentioned it, it's very important for those to rethink, again, what is the next wave of diversification, okay? And this depends on how the global economy will come. What will be the new framework in terms of global cooperation? The other group are countries who are dependent on a certain number of sectors, like tourism, for example, or remittances. This is the case for Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyz Republic. Those countries have had a sudden shock that was important on them. And therefore, this shock affects their ability to attract foreign currency, but also those usually are job-rich sectors and low-skilled labor. And therefore, the impact is double, is both on the balance of payment as well as also on the capacity to provide social support to those. And this is where, for example, what we are providing in terms of rapid facility will help on the balance of payment side. Government need to make sure that they have the right instruments in terms of social protection. And you have countries who have already been part of the global value chain. Georgia is, for example, one of them. Those countries, yes, this is a shock. Nobody likes to go through a crisis, as Koba said. But a crisis is also an opportunity to see what are the issues that were not working well that need to be addressed, and it's the time to do them. And I think both Koba and Khairat mentioned a very important area of reforms, but also what are the new opportunities. And here also, I think from a financial perspective, it's an opportunity today to see how a digital financial integration can work. And this is a new dimension for banks to grow, and also how to develop alternative sources of financing using local markets, creating a larger number of investor base, strengthening the role of the institutional investors, use more maybe the sovereign wealth funds as an institutional investor group in order to deepen and create more liquidity in markets. I think we are still in the eye of the storm, but it's important to start from now, thinking what are the policy response that we need not only for the short term, but also for the medium term.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Jihad. And we know some of the countries as well, they have a lot of migrant workers who are outside of the country. Those workers' incomes are affected, the transfers are affected, and certainly they're poorer countries, and their health systems are perhaps not as prepared or not as well resourced. And some countries we're keeping a very close eye, I know, on food security as well. So poverty, food security, those are affecting some countries more than others. A number of correspondents asked for an assessment of the effectiveness of the measures taken so far. These included our colleagues from the APA news agency in Baku, journalists from Kazakhstan, again the Tazabek news agency in Bishkek, and the Arka news agency in Armenia. Maybe Jihad, you'd like to start very quickly, and then we'll turn to the panelists. Can you assess already the effectiveness of measures taken by the authorities in the CCA so far?
Well, in terms of size, the fiscal measures 4% of GDP is on the high side. I would say this is the level we see for advanced economies. Therefore, I think in terms of impact, in terms of size, this is good size. The question now is how to make sure that those instruments are rapidly activated and are also targeted and not creating any permanent and lasting effect. This is very important. The fiscal instrument is a short-term instrument. For the long term, you need structural reforms. On the monetary side, I think countries have benefited from the experience of the 2015 crisis, and they have learned the lessons. Koba was mentioning that since then, they have increased the level of reserves, and it proved to be very useful. It helped mitigate some of the pressures. But also, it showed us where the challenges are. For EMs, for example, access to liquidity, access to finance internationally is an important element, and I also concur with what Khairat said. It's also an opportunity now to look at how we can broaden the financial instruments and the financial base. Yet I think it's very important to be cautious. We don't know how the crisis is going to unfold, how long it will last, and is it going to be a crisis, a one-off, or we will see repeats. Therefore, one has to be very vigilant and make sure that have the proper utilization of means and protect where the weakness areas are. In the banks, for example, in some of the other SOEs in certain countries, those are area where there's still work to be done. Therefore, I think it's an opportunity today to, after responding rapidly to the crisis, look at the weaknesses and try to address them.
Thank you. Let's maybe turn to Koba and to Khairat on that question. How are you monitoring and how are you considering the effectiveness of the measures that have been taken so far in your countries and in the region? Maybe give us a minute or so on that. Koba first.
Thank you, Mark. I think that I have used this and I have mentioned it many times when I have lectures with students or journalists here, is that when the financial crisis happens, or when crisis like that happens, then lessons are learned and we are doing many things, but then crisis comes from the new corner. So this is what we are experiencing now. That is why we always have to learn the lessons from what have been done, and there will be lessons from this shock as well. I think that whatever has been done in the situation, whatever I have read from other countries is really good. What matters is what the starting point is, and there might be differences, but of course, all countries have realized that they have to do very substantial things. In case of Georgia, I have to say that Georgian authorities have started to act on a health side very timely, and I think we have quite good results at this point, and I hope that we will continue that way, which will help us to recover as soon as possible. And in terms of preparedness for after the crisis, Georgian authorities have put together a comprehensive plan to reach socially vulnerable, to reach small and medium enterprises through guaranteed credit guarantee schemes. We have National Bank of Georgia has also relaxed supervision rules, and at the same time we are providing liquidity to commercial banks to make sure that they continue working. So my assessment is that at this point, understanding of the issues in CCA countries is quite good. Now we have to make sure that we continue that way, and we also look how things which we are doing are working together.
Thank you, Koba. Khairat, you did mention some of the indicators that you're looking at. You're concerned about a rise of NPLs and over the course of the crisis. How do you look at the effectiveness of the measures that are taken to date? They're quite comprehensive. They're large. They're bold. How do you think about assessing the effectiveness so far?
Yeah, I think the Kazakh response to the epidemiological crisis was very strong and bold. So I think that all of these numbers, which is limited numbers of people being infected, and I think that let's say, people of Kazakhstan, we all should appreciate that the response was so quick and so relevant. I mean, in these terms, we should maybe continue to strengthen the capacity of the healthcare system in Kazakhstan, and this is very much important. I think this is like a save people's life is a real priority. In terms of the economic response, is also, like I mentioned, that because of the good fiscal space, we really can help in the short term to the economy to kind of to survive during this very difficult time, because for many small and medium enterprises is a real challenge. And I think what is the government and central bank are doing for supporting the SME and financial institution is really very much relevant. But I think that here is the most important is when will be the, let's say, the global economic recovery. So now what we see that is not visible in this year and not visible in the first half of the next year. So it means that it can be second wave of the crisis, which crisis can be more financial or more epidemiological. So anyway, it will be very much challenging. And in these terms, having this fiscal space, we should think about what is beyond the post-pandemic period should be done. And I think we should not waste time for preparation for the next stage.
Thank you, Kairat. Your answer leads us to our next two questions that I wanted to focus on. We had a very important question from the National Bank of Kazakhstan, our colleagues there. And the question is, do you expect a second wave of the coronavirus? I think from an epidemiological standpoint, will the world economy be able to withstand a second phase of the coronavirus if it occurs, and possible additional quarantine measures in the fall and winter of this year? What should countries do to prepare for this possible second wave? We've learned a lot in the first wave, but what should they do to prepare for the second? Jihad, I'll start with you, and I'd ask you to go a little bit slow in your response because of the translation to Russian. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the answer to the first question needs a medical expert, and then whoever gets this answer will have, I'm sure, a medicine Nobel Prize. Therefore, it's very difficult
Right.
to predict. But what we can see so far, we can see that the level of healthcare infrastructure is different between countries. And this is something that needs to be addressed. This first wave of coronavirus showed us like a stress test where the weaknesses are. And I think this is the priority of the priorities. Countries who have fiscal space or no need to give it the priority. And also need to prepare based on how the system reacted. What are the lessons and things need to be improved if and when the next wave comes. The second element is, I think we will see new form of healthcare protection at the country level, at the international level, that will be deployed. It's very important for countries to think of those, because you will see decoupling globally between countries who have the right framework for healthcare protection, for sanitation, and those who don't. And this, I'm sure, will have an impact on your ability to travel. Three is this first shock showed us that the entry point matters, okay? And therefore, the entry point for countries who had strong economic framework helped them. And therefore, I think what is important today is for countries who have less strong or started with on less strong footing, is to see how they can address some of these challenges. Therefore, I think we live in a moment of uncertainty. A moment of uncertainty is also a moment where innovation can be activated fast. Those are my initial comments on that.
Excellent. Thank you, Jihad. Let's turn briefly to Kairat and to Koba. Kairat, first, how do you see countries and global institutions preparing for a possible second wave in the fall?
Yeah, I think here is like two tiers. One is like recently the president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, mentioned that we now should focus on real quality of the healthcare system in Kazakhstan. So means that it will be like post-crisis measures just to realize where we have a missing point, where we should strengthen in our capacity. So this is, I think, so we should anyway be prepared to whatever future epidemics or pandemics. So even it's not happened, the system should be prepared. So this is the lessons which been concluded from what happened recently. And number two, I think that what I see in distinction with the global financial crisis in 2008, there is no yet enough global cooperation. So I think that we all are now reading the articles about new vaccines or new antibodies approach or whatever. I think as weaker countries, developed countries, emerging markets will join together and really will finalize kind of the common approach or will be in the same page, it will be much better for everybody, because without this, it will be very difficult to really fight with this epidemiological crisis. And here the organization like WHO or G20, IMF should play a significant role.
Thank you, Kairat. We're grateful for that strong message for international cooperation and more of it. Koba, do you have a word or two you'd like to add on this subject?
Yes, Mark. I think that we, in a way, by default, we have to act. We have to hope for the best, but we have to plan for the worst, I think. And what my colleague Kairat also mentioned, issues like working on distance learning. Yes, we do have it, but how to improve it just in case it will be necessary again to use later this year. For communication services, of course, for healthcare services. And even though we have resources and we are mobilizing resources, I think that we have to make sure that we don't exhaust all of them, that whatever we do, we see how efficient these measures are, what kind of resources do we have, and always have some room in case there is something else. Because I'm sure financial institutions will be there, bilateral donors will be there, countries will also have their resources, but since we don't know the nature of this epidemic yet, we always need to be on the safe side. And of course, innovation in technology, and financial intermediation will be as useful as always.
Thank you, Koba. Another, I would say, inspiring response. So what we hear is innovation, cooperation globally, preparation, mindful of differences in countries and worldwide, so we can keep our focus of attention on the poor and the most vulnerable, and keeping buffers, and then returning quickly to structural reforms to help our economies recover after the crisis has passed. I'm afraid we've reached right at the end of our 1 hour. We had a number of questions on IMF financing arrangements with specific countries in the region. I would like to propose that we will answer these bilaterally to the journalists and other stakeholders that proposed or asked those questions. Jihad, the last word is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark, and I would like to thank both the excellent panelists today, Koba and Kairat, for their very interesting and useful comments from the trenches. We at the fund, we consider our role at this stage as a firefighter to be at the side of countries. And this is the purpose of the facilities that we have developed. We consider also our role to provide them assistance as their trusted advisor. And also we consider, and this is to echo what Kairat said at the end, also to be the advocate globally in order to increase the level of global cooperation. And those are the three directions that we will follow, and we will keep our engagement in the region that is very important for us and very important also for the world economy.
Thank you. Stay safe, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your interest in the regional economic outlook for the Caucasus and Central Asia countries. Thank you.
Thank you.